Hello there and welcome to what might be the strangest journey through time you'll take today. Before we begin, I'm curious. What time is it where you're watching this? Are you settling in for the evening in New York, catching this during your lunch break in London? Or perhaps it's the middle of the night in Tokyo and you can't sleep. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, you're about to discover that your relationship with sleep, that thing you do for roughly 8 hours every night, would have been utterly alien to someone living just 600 years ago. Picture this. It's 2 a.m. on a winter night in medieval England, and instead of the dead silence you'd expect, entire villages are alive with activity. People are visiting neighbors, having sex, praying, crafting, even committing crimes. Children are being conceived at rates that would make modern statisticians scratch their heads. And here's the kicker. This isn't insomnia or some sleep disorder. This is normal. This is how humans slept for thousands of years before we civilized ourselves into our modern 8-hour slumber. You see, medieval people didn't sleep the way we do. They didn't collapse into bed at 11 p.m. and emerge zombie-like at 7 a.m. clutching a coffee mug. Instead, they practiced something so foreign to our modern minds that when historians first discovered evidence of it, they thought they were reading about sleep disorders or unusual medical conditions. Medieval people slept in 2 distinct chunks, separated by a period of wakefulness that was so common, so universal, that it had dozens of names across different languages and cultures. They called it the watch, the watching, first sleep, and second sleep, or sometimes simply the gap. The French called it dorveille. The Italians knew it as di prima sonno and di secondo sonno. This wasn't some quaint medieval custom. This was the default human sleep pattern, hardwired into our biology for millennia, until we literally illuminated it out of existence. But that's just the beginning of how weird medieval sleep gets. These people had sleep practices that would send modern sleep experts into fits of confusion. They slept sitting up on purpose. They shared beds with complete strangers as a mark of hospitality. They had elaborate rituals involving bears, herbs that could supposedly give you prophetic dreams, and sleep positions that were believed to determine everything from your personality to your likelihood of being possessed by demons. Medieval people treated sleep as a dangerous journey into an unknown realm where your soul could be stolen, where demons lurked in every shadow, and where the boundary between life and death was gossamer thin. They developed incredibly sophisticated and utterly bizarre strategies for protecting themselves during their nightly vulnerability. Some of these strategies were based on genuine observations about sleep and health. Others were pure superstition. All of them reveal a relationship with sleep so different from ours that it might as well be describing an alien species. And perhaps most shocking of all, the medieval approach to sleep might actually have been healthier than our modern 1-block, 8-hour standard. Recent scientific research has begun to suggest that biphasic sleep, sleeping in 2 segments, might be more natural for humans than our current monophasic pattern. Studies of people isolated from artificial light often spontaneously develop something remarkably similar to medieval sleep patterns. Could it be that in our rush toward modernity, we've actually broken something fundamental about how we rest? Tonight, we're going to explore these weird, wonderful, and sometimes terrifying sleep habits of medieval people. We'll discover why they thought sleeping alone was dangerous, why they believed certain sleeping positions could damn your soul, and how they used sleep as a form of medicine, entertainment, and even warfare. We're going to meet medieval people who were so afraid of sleep that they hired professional watchers to guard them through the night, and others who were so skilled at controlling their dreams that they claimed to travel to other worlds in their sleep. We'll explore the medieval bedroom, if you can even call it that, where privacy was non-existent, where entire families shared single beds, and where the arrangement of pillows and blankets was believed to influence everything from fertility to protection from evil spirits. We'll discover how medieval people used sleep deprivation as both punishment and purification. how they treated nightmares as literal visits from demons, and how they developed sleep schedules that would horrify modern parents, but somehow produced some of history's most creative and productive individuals. This isn't just a curiosity tour through quaint historical practices. Understanding how medieval people slept opens a window into how they thought, how they lived, and how they understood the fundamental rhythms of human existence. Their weird sleep habits weren't just random quirks, they were sophisticated responses to a world without electric lights, without alarm clocks, without the artificial rhythms that now govern our lives. More importantly, exploring medieval sleep might help us understand what we've lost. In our quest for efficiency and productivity, have we sacrificed something essential about human rest? Have we traded the natural ebb and flow of sleep and wakefulness for something more convenient but less healthy? The medieval approach to sleep wasn't just different in many ways, it was more attuned to human biology than our current practices. So settle in, get comfortable, and prepare to have everything you think you know about sleep turned upside down. Because once you understand how medieval people slept, you'll never look at your own bedtime routine the same way again. And who knows, you might even discover that some of these weird medieval sleep habits are exactly what your modern, sleep-deprived life has been missing. The story of medieval sleep begins at sunset, but not in the way you might expect. For medieval people, the end of daylight didn't signal immediate bedtime. Instead, it marked the beginning of a carefully orchestrated dance between activity and rest that would continue throughout the night. This dance was so fundamental to medieval life that it shaped everything from architecture to agriculture, from religion to romance. When the sun disappeared behind the horizon in a medieval village, the first thing that happened wasn't people rushing to bed. Instead, families gathered for what they called the first sitting. This was a time for completing daily tasks that didn't require bright light, mending clothes, telling stories, discussing the events of the day, or engaging in what medieval documents delicately refer to as marital duties. The first sitting could last anywhere from 1 to 3 hours after sunset, depending on the season, the family's economic status, and what needed to be accomplished. But here's where it gets interesting. Medieval people didn't fight against their drowsiness during this period. They embraced it. They understood that there were different qualities of tiredness throughout the evening, and they worked with these natural rhythms rather than against them. Modern sleep researchers have discovered that they were actually correct. Human alertness does indeed fluctuate in predictable patterns throughout the evening, and medieval people had unconsciously organized their lives around these fluctuations. When the first wave of serious sleepiness hit, usually between 2 and 4 hours after sunset, medieval people didn't resist it. They went to bed. But this wasn't bedtime as we understand it. This was the beginning of first sleep, and it was expected to last only 4 to 6 hours. They knew with absolute certainty that they would wake up in the middle of the night. They planned for it. They looked forward to it. The beds they slept in during first sleep were unlike anything we'd recognize today. Medieval beds weren't just sleeping surfaces. They were complex architectural structures that served multiple functions throughout the day and night. The wealthy slept in massive wooden constructions that were essentially rooms within rooms, complete with curtains, storage compartments, and sometimes even small altars for nighttime prayers. But most medieval people weren't wealthy, and their sleeping arrangements were far more communal and far stranger than we can easily imagine. Entire families, parents, children, grandparents, sometimes servants or apprentices, would share single sleeping surfaces. This wasn't due to poverty alone, though economics certainly played a role. Medieval people genuinely believed that sleeping alone was dangerous. The danger wasn't just physical, though that was certainly a concern in an era without police forces or door locks. The danger was spiritual. Medieval people believed that sleep made you vulnerable to demonic attack, and that the presence of other people provided protection. They had elaborate theories about how demons could enter through the ears, nose, or mouth of sleeping people, and how the breathing and movement of bedmates could disrupt these attacks. This belief in the spiritual dangers of sleep wasn't just peasant superstition. Learned theologians wrote extensively about the theological implications of sleep, developing complex theories about what happened to the soul during unconsciousness. They debated whether dreams came from God, from demons, or from indigestion. They worried about whether people could sin while asleep and whether demons could possess unconscious bodies. These concerns shaped not just where medieval people slept, but how they slept. Sleeping positions weren't matters of personal comfort. They were moral and spiritual choices. Sleeping on your back was considered dangerous because it left your mouth and nose exposed to demonic entry. Sleeping on your stomach was even worse because it was associated with lustful thoughts and was believed to cause prophetic dreams, which were considered spiritually dangerous for ordinary people. The preferred medieval sleeping position was on the right side, with the head slightly elevated and the hands positioned in prayer. This position was believed to aid digestion, protect the heart, and keep the airways clear for both breathing and prayer. Medieval medical texts provided detailed instructions for proper sleeping posture, complete with warnings about the dire consequences of improper positioning, but the weirdness of medieval sleep arrangements goes far beyond position and companionship. Medieval people had entirely different relationships with bedding, clothing, and bedroom environments. Most people slept fully clothed, or nearly so. The idea of special sleeping garments was largely unknown outside of the very wealthy. People slept in their daily clothes, sometimes removing their outer garments but keeping their underclothes on. This practice wasn't just about warmth, though medieval houses were certainly cold. It was about readiness. Medieval people expected to wake up during the night, and they expected to be active during those wakeful periods. They needed to be dressed and ready for whatever the night might bring, whether that was tending to animals, responding to emergencies, or simply engaging in the social activities that were normal parts of medieval nightlife. The bedding itself was far more than just comfort items. Medieval beds were constructed with multiple layers, each serving specific purposes. The bottom layer was usually straw or hay, replaced regularly to prevent infestations. Above that were woolen mattresses, often stuffed with feathers for the wealthy or more straw for the poor. But the arrangement of these layers wasn't random. It was designed to create specific sleeping conditions that medieval people believed were essential for health. They understood, for instance, that elevation affected sleep quality. Medieval beds were often quite high off the ground, not just for status, but because they believed that sleeping closer to the earth made you more vulnerable to bad air and evil influences. They also understood that firmness mattered. Medieval medical texts prescribed different levels of mattress firmness for different types of people and different health conditions. The pillows were perhaps the strangest part of medieval bedding. Wealthy people sometimes slept with their heads elevated on wooden blocks wrapped in cloth, believing that this prevented nightmares and encouraged prophetic dreams. Others used pillows stuffed with specific herbs chosen for their supposed effects on sleep and dreams. Lavender was common, but so were more exotic herbs like vervain, which was believed to provide protection against demons, or mugwort, which was supposed to enhance dream vividness. But the most bizarre aspect of medieval pillows was their role in sleep magic. Medieval people practiced elaborate rituals involving their pillows, from hiding specific objects under them to attract good dreams, to performing complex blessings to ward off nightmares. Some pillows were constructed with hidden compartments, containing religious relics, protective amulets, or herbs chosen according to astrological calculations. The blankets and coverlets were equally laden with meaning and superstition. Medieval people believed that the way you arranged your blankets could influence your dreams, your health, and your spiritual state. Certain patterns of folding and tucking were believed to create protective barriers against evil influences. Some families had specific blanket arranging rituals that were passed down through generations, complete with prayers and incantations. Color mattered too. Medieval people had elaborate theories about how different colored bedding affected sleep. Red was believed to cause violent dreams, but also to provide protection against demons. Blue was supposed to encourage peaceful sleep, but was also associated with melancholy. White was considered the safest choice for most people, but it was also believed to make the sleeper more vulnerable to spiritual visions, which could be either blessing or curse, depending on the person's spiritual state. All of these preparations were necessary because medieval people understood that sleep wasn't just rest, it was a journey. Every night they believed the soul embarked on a dangerous voyage through realms populated by angels, demons, the dead, and other supernatural beings. The physical preparations for sleep were also spiritual preparations for this nightly journey. And then, after all these preparations, after the careful arrangement of bodies and bedding and protective rituals, medieval people would settle into their first sleep. But this wasn't the deep, uninterrupted slumber that modern people consider ideal. Medieval first sleep was lighter, more interrupted, more social than our modern concept of sleep. People expected to wake briefly during first sleep, to check on children, to tend fires, to listen for unusual sounds that might indicate danger. These brief awakenings weren't considered sleep disturbances. They were normal parts of the sleep experience. Medieval people had developed the ability to wake, assess their situation, and return to sleep without the grogginess and disorientation that modern people experience when awakened unexpectedly. They also expected first sleep to be shared in ways that would horrify modern people. Conversation during first sleep was normal. Quiet discussions, prayers, even intimate activities were all considered appropriate during the lighter phases of first sleep. The idea that sleep should be silent, private, and uninterrupted was completely foreign to medieval people. This social aspect of first sleep extended beyond the family. In medieval inns, strangers routinely shared beds, and quiet conversation between bed partners was not only acceptable but expected. Refusing to speak with your bedmate was considered rude and antisocial. Medieval people had developed elaborate etiquettes for bed sharing with strangers, including rules about conversation topics, physical positioning, and mutual obligations for safety and comfort. The economic aspects of medieval sleep were equally strange. Sleep wasn't free in the way we understand it today. Bed space was a commodity that was bought, sold, rented, and shared according to complex social and economic rules. In cities, bed rental was a thriving business. People rented not just rooms but specific portions of beds, sometimes by the hour. Professional bed warmers were common in wealthy households. These were servants whose job was to warm beds before their masters retired, but also to remain available throughout the night for various services. Some bed warmers were expected to stay awake during their employer's first sleep, ready to respond to any needs that arose. Others were expected to sleep lightly, maintaining a state of semi-alertness throughout the night. The legal implications of medieval sleeping arrangements were complex and far-reaching. Laws governed who could share beds with whom, under what circumstances, and with what protections. Adultery laws had to account for the reality that people routinely shared beds with multiple individuals throughout the night. Property laws dealt with the inheritance rights of people who had been conceived during the midnight wakeful periods that were normal parts of medieval sleep. Marriage laws were particularly complex because medieval people recognized different types of marital intimacy, some of which were specifically associated with different parts of the sleep cycle. The intimacy that occurred during the midnight waking period was considered different from and in some ways more significant than, intimacy that occurred during normal waking hours. Medieval marriage manuals provided detailed guidance about the spiritual and physical aspects of nighttime marital relations. But first sleep was just the beginning of the medieval night. After 4 to 6 hours of this light, social, interrupted slumber, medieval people would enter the most distinctive phase of their sleep cycle, the midnight waking period that defined medieval nightlife and created a world of activity that modern people can barely imagine. The midnight waking period, that stretch of consciousness between first and second sleep, was when medieval life truly came alive in ways that would seem utterly alien to modern people. This wasn't a time of grogginess or disorientation. Medieval people woke from first sleep naturally and completely, often more alert and creative than they were during daylight hours. They had evolved sophisticated uses for this nighttime consciousness that shaped everything from literature to religion to the most intimate aspects of human relationships. For medieval people, the hours between midnight and 2 a.m. were considered the most productive time for certain types of activities. This was when they engaged in deep thinking, creative work, and spiritual contemplation. The darkness and quiet provided a quality of mental focus that was impossible during the busy daylight hours. Medieval scholars wrote about the unique clarity of thought that came during these midnight hours, describing it as a time when the mind was freed from the distractions and corruptions of daily life. The activities that medieval people engaged in during their midnight waking period were incredibly diverse. Craftspeople used this time for detailed work that required intense concentration. Jewelers setting precious stones, scribes copying important manuscripts, weavers working on complex patterns. The light from candles or oil lamps was actually better for some types of precision work than the bright but shifting light of day. But the midnight hours weren't just for work. They were also for play, for intimacy, for socializing in ways that were impossible during the structured daylight hours. Medieval people visited neighbors during these midnight hours, often walking through dark streets without fear or concern. Night visiting was so common that most medieval houses had specific protocols for receiving midnight visitors. Special knocks, password systems, and welcoming rituals that acknowledged the spiritual significance of nighttime hospitality. The sexual lives of medieval people were profoundly shaped by these midnight waking periods. Medieval medical texts and marriage manuals described the midnight hours as the optimal time for conception, believing that children conceived during these quiet, dark hours would be healthier, more intelligent, and more spiritually blessed than those conceived during daylight. Statistical analysis of medieval birth records suggests that they might have been correct. There are indeed unusual spikes in births that would correspond to conception during these midnight periods. Medieval people had elaborate theories about why midnight intimacy was superior. They believed that the darkness provided spiritual protection for the act of conception, shielding it from evil influences that were active during daylight. They also believed that the quiet and privacy of the midnight hours allowed for a type of intimacy that was impossible during the busy communal daylight periods. The religious aspects of medieval midnight waking were equally sophisticated. This was considered the optimal time for prayer, meditation, and spiritual contemplation. Many medieval people had specific prayers and rituals that they performed only during these midnight hours. Monasteries organized their entire schedules around midnight prayers, with elaborate services that took advantage of the unique spiritual qualities attributed to these dark hours. Medieval people believed that the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds was thinner during these midnight hours. They developed practices for what they called night watching, forms of meditation and prayer that were designed to take advantage of this spiritual accessibility. Some medieval mystics claimed to have their most profound religious experiences during these midnight periods, describing visions, revelations, and direct communications with divine beings. But the midnight waking period wasn't just individual, it was deeply social. Medieval people had developed forms of community interaction that were specific to these nighttime hours. They played games that were designed for darkness, told stories that were considered too frightening or too sacred for daylight hours, and engaged in forms of music and entertainment that took advantage of the acoustic properties of the quiet night. Night markets were common in medieval cities during certain times of the year. These weren't just practical arrangements for people who worked during the day. They were social institutions that took advantage of the unique qualities of midnight consciousness. Medieval people claimed that they could make better decisions, form clearer judgments, and engage in more honest communication during these dark hours. The foods that medieval people ate during their midnight waking periods were different from their daytime meals. They had specific midnight foods, light, easily digestible items that were believed to enhance mental clarity and spiritual awareness. Medieval cookbooks included entire sections devoted to night foods, recipes specifically designed for consumption during the midnight waking period. Some of these night foods were believed to enhance dreams or provide spiritual protection. Others were thought to increase mental acuity or creative inspiration. Medieval people had elaborate theories about how different foods affected consciousness during the vulnerable midnight hours, and they planned their midnight meals as carefully as modern people plan their morning coffee. The economics of medieval midnight activity were substantial. Entire industries were built around serving the needs of people during their midnight waking periods. Night bakers provided fresh bread for midnight meals. Night craftspeople created items specifically for nighttime use. Night entertainers, musicians, storytellers, and performers specialized in arts designed for midnight audiences. Professional night watchers were employed by wealthy families not just for security, but to enhance the midnight waking experience. These watchers were trained in conversation, music, and entertainment. They were expected to be knowledgeable about current events, skilled in various games, and capable of providing interesting companionship during the midnight hours. The midnight waking period was also when medieval people engaged in activities that were considered too dangerous or too spiritually significant for daylight hours. This was when they practiced various forms of divination, when they conducted certain types of business negotiations, and when they made important life decisions. Medieval people believed that the clarity of thought available during midnight hours made this the optimal time for any activity that required serious judgment. But perhaps most remarkably, the midnight waking period was when medieval people were most creative. An enormous amount of medieval literature, art, and intellectual work was produced during these dark hours. Medieval writers described the midnight hours as a time when inspiration flowed more freely, when creative blocks dissolved, and when new ideas emerged with startling clarity. Modern studies of creativity and circadian rhythms suggest that medieval people might have been onto something. There is indeed evidence that certain types of creative thinking are enhanced during the natural dips in circadian alertness that occur during the early morning hours. Medieval people may have unconsciously developed a sleep pattern that optimized their creative potential. The transition from the midnight waking period to second sleep was as ritualized and meaningful as the earlier transition to first sleep. Medieval people had specific activities that they used to prepare for second sleep. Prayers, meditations, physical exercises, and mental techniques designed to ensure that second sleep would be deep, restorative, and spiritually beneficial. Second, sleep was different from first sleep in almost every way. Where first sleep was light, social, and frequently interrupted, second sleep was intended to be deep, private, and restorative. Medieval people understood that they needed both types of sleep, and they had developed sophisticated techniques for transitioning between them. The preparations for second sleep were often more elaborate than those for first sleep. This was when medieval people engaged in their most serious spiritual protection rituals. They believed that second sleep, being deeper and longer, made them more vulnerable to supernatural attack. They developed complex bedtime routines designed to provide maximum protection during this vulnerable period. Some medieval people hired professional sleep guardians, people whose job was to remain awake and watchful during others' second sleep. These guardians weren't just security personnel, they were spiritual protectors who knew how to recognize and respond to supernatural threats. They were trained in various forms of protective magic, prayer, and spiritual warfare. The physical positioning for second sleep was often different from that used during first sleep. Medieval people believed that different sleeping positions were appropriate for different parts of the night, and they adjusted their posture according to elaborate systems that took into account everything from the phase of the moon to their personal astrological charts. But second sleep wasn't just about rest and protection. It was also when medieval people experienced their most significant dreams. They believed that the dreams that came during second sleep were more meaningful, more prophetic, and more spiritually significant than those that occurred during first sleep. They developed elaborate systems for interpreting these dreams and incorporating their messages into daily life. Medieval dream interpretation was far more sophisticated than simple superstition. They had detailed theories about different types of dreams when they occurred during the sleep cycle and what they meant. They understood that dreams were influenced by physical health, emotional state, spiritual condition, and external circumstances. Their dream interpretation systems took all of these factors into account. The ending of second sleep, the final awakening of the medieval night, was as important as any other part of the cycle. Medieval people didn't just wake up, they performed specific rituals designed to ease the transition from sleep to wakefulness, to retain the benefits of their nighttime experiences, and to prepare for the challenges of the coming day. These morning rituals often involved reviewing and interpreting the dreams from second sleep, performing gratitude prayers for surviving the spiritual dangers of the night, and mentally preparing for the activities of the coming day. Medieval people understood that the quality of their awakening affected their entire day, and they gave careful attention to making this transition as smooth and beneficial as possible. The medieval relationship with sleep wasn't just about individual health and rest. It was a complex social, spiritual, and economic system that shaped every aspect of medieval life. Understanding this system helps us see medieval people not as primitive or superstitious, but as sophisticated practitioners of a lifestyle that was carefully adapted to human biology and the realities of pre-industrial life. But the story of medieval sleep becomes even stranger when we look at the specific practices, beliefs, and rituals that medieval people developed around sleep and dreams. These weren't just quaint customs. They were elaborate systems based on careful observation of sleep patterns, dream content, and the relationship between rest and health. Medieval people were obsessed with the idea that sleep made them vulnerable to supernatural attack, and they developed incredibly sophisticated and often bizarre methods for protecting themselves during their nightly vulnerability. These protection systems were based on complex theories about how supernatural forces operated when they were most active, and how they could be detected and repelled. One of the most common protective practices was the use of sleep amulets, objects specifically designed to be worn or placed near the bed to provide supernatural protection during sleep. These weren't just simple good luck charms. Medieval sleep amulets were complex devices, often incorporating multiple materials, symbols, and blessed substances, each chosen for specific protective properties. A typical medieval sleep amulet might contain blessed salt to repel demons, iron filings to confuse evil spirits, herbs chosen according to astrological calculations, written prayers or biblical verses, and sometimes small relics from saints who were believed to provide special protection to sleepers. These amulets were often sewn into pillows or mattresses, worn on the body during sleep, or hung above the bed in specific arrangements. The creation of sleep amulets was itself a complex ritual process. Medieval people believed that the effectiveness of an amulet depended not just on its contents, but on when it was made, by whom, and under what spiritual conditions. Some amulets had to be created during specific phases of the moon, blessed by certain types of religious authorities, or constructed using materials that had been gathered under particular circumstances. But sleep amulets were just one part of medieval sleep protection systems. Medieval people also used what they called sleep barriers, physical arrangements designed to prevent supernatural entities from approaching sleeping people. These barriers could be as simple as circles of salt around the bed, or as complex as elaborate arrangements of furniture, religious symbols, and blessed objects. Some medieval sleep barriers involved the strategic placement of mirrors, which were believed to confuse demons and evil spirits by reflecting their images back at them. Others used arrangements of iron objects, which were thought to be painful or repulsive to supernatural beings. Still others incorporated water, blessed or otherwise, which was believed to create an impassable barrier for many types of evil entities. The most sophisticated sleep barriers were architectural. Wealthy medieval people sometimes constructed their bedrooms with specific features designed to provide supernatural protection. These might include walls painted with protective symbols, floors laid with specific patterns of tiles or stones, or ceilings decorated with astrological charts calculated to provide maximum spiritual protection. Medieval people also developed elaborate sleep monitoring systems designed to detect supernatural attack during sleep. These weren't just paranoid delusions. They were based on careful observation of sleep disturbances and their potential causes. Medieval people had detailed knowledge of the physical signs that might indicate supernatural interference with sleep. They knew, for instance, that certain types of nightmares were more likely to be supernatural in origin than others. They had specific criteria for distinguishing between ordinary bad dreams and demonic attacks. They understood that some sleep disturbances were caused by physical or emotional problems, while others indicated spiritual threats that required different types of intervention. Professional sleep monitors were employed by wealthy medieval families to watch for signs of supernatural attack during sleep. These monitors were trained to recognize the subtle signs that might indicate demonic interference, changes in breathing patterns, unusual movements, specific types of vocalizations, or alterations in the sleeper's appearance that might indicate spiritual distress. But medieval sleep protection wasn't just about defense against evil forces. Medieval people also developed practices designed to attract positive supernatural influences during sleep. They believed that sleep could be a time of blessing, inspiration, and divine communication, and they worked to create conditions that would encourage these positive spiritual experiences. Sleep blessing rituals were common in medieval households. These were ceremonies performed before sleep to invite divine protection and positive spiritual influences. A typical sleep blessing might involve prayers to specific saints, the burning of blessed incense, the sprinkling of holy water, and the recitation of protective formulas that had been passed down through generations. Some medieval people practiced what they called dream calling, rituals designed to encourage specific types of dreams. They believed that through proper preparation and spiritual practice, they could invite particular saints, angels, or divine beings to communicate with them through dreams. These weren't casual superstitions. They were sophisticated spiritual practices that required extensive preparation and training. Medieval dream-calling rituals often involved fasting, prayer, the use of specific herbs or incenses, and the performance of particular physical exercises designed to prepare the mind and spirit for divine communication. Practitioners had to purify themselves spiritually and physically, often for days or weeks before attempting to call specific dreams. The herbs that medieval people used in connection with sleep and dreams were chosen according to complex systems that combined medical knowledge astrological theory, and spiritual belief. Medieval herbalists had extensive knowledge of plants that affected sleep, dreams, and consciousness, and they used this knowledge to create sophisticated sleep medicines. Valerian was commonly used to encourage deep sleep, but medieval people understood that different preparations of valerian had different effects depending on when it was harvested, how it was prepared, and what other herbs it was combined with. They had detailed knowledge of dosages, timing, and individual variations in response to herbal sleep medications. Mugwort was perhaps the most important medieval dream herb. Medieval people believed that mugwort could enhance dream vividness, improve dream recall, and even allow the dreamer to control the content of their dreams. They had elaborate methods for preparing and using mugwort, including specific rituals for gathering the plant, prayers to be recited during preparation, and detailed instructions for how and when to use it. But mugwort was considered spiritually dangerous as well as beneficial. Medieval people believed that the enhanced dreaming it produced could make the user more vulnerable to demonic attack or spiritual deception. They developed complex safety protocols for mugwort use, including protective rituals, spiritual purification, practices and methods for distinguishing between divinely inspired dreams and demonic deceptions. Other medieval dream herbs included vervain, which was believed to provide protection against nightmares, lavender, which was used to encourage peaceful sleep, and rosemary, which was thought to improve memory and dream recall. Each herb had its own associated rituals, safety protocols, and specific applications depending on the user's spiritual state and particular needs. The preparation of medieval sleep herbs was itself a form of spiritual practice. Medieval herbalists believed that the effectiveness of their preparations depended not just on the plants themselves, but on the spiritual state of the preparer, the conditions under which the preparation was made, and the prayers and rituals that accompanied the process. Some medieval sleep preparations required the herbalist to fast for specific periods before beginning work. Others had to be prepared during particular phases of the moon or under specific astrological conditions. Still, others required the recitation of particular prayers or the performance of specific rituals during the preparation process. But perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of medieval sleep practice was their understanding of what we now call lucid dreaming, the ability to become conscious within dreams and potentially control dream content. Medieval people didn't use the term lucid dreaming, but they had extensive knowledge of what they called wakeful dreaming or conscious sleeping. The spring and autumn transitions were considered particularly important and potentially dangerous times for sleep. Medieval people believed that the changing balance between light and dark during these seasonal transitions made them more vulnerable to spiritual attack and physical illness. They developed specific practices for managing sleep during these transitional periods, including special protective rituals, dietary changes, and modifications to their normal sleep schedules. Medieval theories about sleep and health were far more sophisticated than simple folk medicine. Medieval physicians had detailed understanding of how sleep affected digestion, circulation, mental function, and emotional stability. They prescribed specific sleep practices as treatments for various illnesses and as preventive health measures. Medieval medical texts included extensive sections on sleep medicine, with detailed instructions for using sleep timing, duration, position, and environment as therapeutic tools. Medieval physicians understood that different types of sleep problems required different treatments, and they had sophisticated diagnostic methods for determining what type of sleep intervention would be most effective for particular patients. Insomnia was recognized as a serious medical condition, but medieval physicians distinguished between different types of sleeplessness. They understood that some insomnia was caused by physical problems, some by emotional distress, and some by spiritual difficulties. Each type required different treatments, ranging from herbal medicines to dietary changes to spiritual counseling. Medieval physicians also recognized what we now call sleep disorders, though they understood them within their own theoretical framework. They had detailed descriptions of conditions that we would now recognize as sleep apnea, restless leg syndrome, and various types of parasomnias. Their treatments for these conditions often combined physical interventions with spiritual practices, reflecting their holistic understanding of sleep and health. But perhaps most remarkably, medieval physicians understood that sleep quality affected mental health in ways that wouldn't be fully recognized by mainstream medicine until the 20th century. They prescribed specific sleep practices for treating what they called melancholia, mania, and other mental conditions, understanding that proper sleep was essential for emotional stability and mental clarity. Medieval sleep medicine also included sophisticated understanding of how different life stages affected sleep needs and patterns. They had specific recommendations for children's sleep, understanding that growing bodies and minds had different requirements than adults. They also recognized that elderly people had different sleep patterns and needs, and they developed age-specific sleep practices and treatments. The sleep practices prescribed for children were particularly detailed and complex. Medieval people believed that childhood sleep patterns affected not just physical development, but also moral character, intellectual capacity, and spiritual development. They had elaborate systems for organizing children's sleep to optimize all of these outcomes. Medieval parents were taught to pay careful attention to their children's sleep positions, believing that how a child slept influenced personality development. Children who slept on their backs were thought to become lazy and spiritually vulnerable. Those who slept on their stomachs were believed to develop lustful tendencies. The preferred position for children was on the right side, which was thought to encourage proper moral development and spiritual growth. But medieval child sleep practices went far beyond positioning. Medieval parents had detailed schedules for gradually transitioning children from the adult pattern of biphasic sleep to full participation in the complex nighttime social activities that characterized medieval sleep culture. This transition was considered a crucial part of growing up, requiring careful management and extensive preparation. Children were taught specific prayers and protective rituals for use during sleep from an early age. These weren't just simple bedtime prayers. They were sophisticated spiritual practices designed to provide protection during the vulnerable sleep period and to prepare children for the complex spiritual challenges they would face as adult sleepers. Medieval coming-of-age ceremonies often included elements related to sleep practices. Young people were formally inducted into adult sleep culture through rituals that taught them the full range of nighttime activities, spiritual practices, and social obligations that characterized mature medieval sleep patterns. The economic aspects of medieval child sleep were significant. Families invested considerable resources in creating proper sleeping environments for their children. Understanding that childhood sleep quality would affect the child's future productivity, health, and social status. Wealthy families employed professional child sleep attendants, servants whose specific responsibility was to monitor and manage children's sleep. But child sleep wasn't just a family matter. It was a community concern. Medieval communities had shared standards for child sleep practices, and parents who failed to provide appropriate sleep conditions for their children could face social censure or even legal consequences. The community had a recognized interest in ensuring that children received proper sleep training and protection. Medieval educational theory explicitly incorporated sleep patterns and dream experiences as learning tools. Medieval educators understood that children learned differently during different states of consciousness, and they developed teaching methods that took advantage of the unique learning opportunities provided by various sleep and dream states. Some medieval schools organized their schedules around student sleep patterns, understanding that certain types of learning were most effective during specific parts of the sleep cycle. They also taught students how to use their dreams as study aids, believing that properly managed dream experiences could enhance memory, understanding, and creative problem-solving. Medieval universities had elaborate regulations governing student sleep practices. These weren't just dormitory rules, they were educational policies based on theories about how sleep patterns affected learning, moral development, and intellectual achievement. University authorities believed that proper sleep practices were as important as formal coursework for producing educated, capable graduates. The sleep practices of medieval scholars and intellectuals were particularly sophisticated. Medieval academics understood that different types of intellectual work were best performed during different states of consciousness, and they organized their research and writing schedules around their sleep cycles. Many medieval scholars did their most important creative work during the midnight waking period, believing that the quiet darkness provided optimal conditions for deep thinking and original insights. They developed techniques for extending and enhancing this midnight creativity, including specific dietary practices, environmental modifications, and mental exercises designed to maximize intellectual productivity during these dark hours. Medieval libraries and scriptoriums were often designed to accommodate nighttime work. They included facilities for safe nighttime illumination, comfortable seating for extended midnight work sessions, and security measures to protect valuable manuscripts during the vulnerable nighttime hours when they were being used for research and copying. The relationship between medieval sleep practices and artistic creativity was profound and systematic. Medieval artists, musicians, and writers had developed sophisticated methods for using sleep and dreams as sources of inspiration and as tools for developing their creative abilities. Medieval artistic training often included instruction in dream work and sleep-based creativity techniques. Young artists were taught how to prepare for sleep in ways that would encourage artistically useful dreams, how to remember and record dream imagery, and how to translate dream experiences into their artistic work. Some medieval art forms were specifically designed to be created during particular sleep states. Certain types of music were composed during the midnight waking period, taking advantage of the unique acoustic properties of the quiet night and the particular quality of consciousness available during these dark hours. Some forms of poetry were specifically associated with dream states, using imagery and linguistic techniques that were believed to reproduce the quality of dream experience. Medieval artistic guilds often had specific regulations governing their members' sleep practices, understanding that proper sleep was essential for maintaining the quality and consistency of artistic work. These regulations weren't just about ensuring that artists were rested enough to work effectively. They were based on sophisticated theories about how different sleep practices affected artistic ability and creative inspiration. The role of dreams in medieval artistic creation was systematic and sophisticated. Medieval artists had detailed methods for interpreting their dreams as sources of artistic inspiration, for distinguishing between dreams that contained genuine creative insights and those that were merely random mental activity, and for translating dream experiences into their artistic work. Some medieval artists practiced what they called dream commission, techniques for requesting specific types of artistic inspiration through dreams. These practices involved elaborate preparation rituals, specific prayers to patron saints of various art forms, and systematic methods for incubating dreams that would provide solutions to particular artistic challenges. But the influence of medieval sleep practices extended beyond individual creativity to the very structure of medieval artistic traditions. Many medieval art forms were specifically designed to be experienced during particular sleep states or times of night. Some types of music were performed only during the midnight waking period. Certain forms of storytelling were reserved for specific parts of the sleep cycle. Medieval religious art was particularly influenced by sleep and dream experiences. Many medieval religious artists claimed that their most important works were directly inspired by dreams or visions received during sleep. The iconography of medieval religious art often incorporated imagery that was specifically derived from dream experiences, using visual symbols and compositional techniques that were believed to reproduce the quality of divine dreams. The architecture of medieval churches and monasteries was designed with sleep practices in mind. Many religious buildings included specific spaces for sleep-related religious practices, areas for midnight prayers, chambers for religious dream incubation, and architectural features that were believed to enhance the spiritual quality of sleep and dreams. Medieval religious communities organized their entire daily schedules around sleep patterns, understanding that the timing of religious activities relative to sleep cycles affected their spiritual effectiveness. Monastic rules included detailed regulations about sleep practices, not just as matters of personal discipline, but as essential elements of communal religious life. The relationship between medieval sleep practices and military culture was complex and strategically important. Medieval armies had to accommodate the natural sleep patterns of their soldiers while maintaining security and operational effectiveness. This led to sophisticated military sleep management systems that were far more complex than simple guard duty rotations. Medieval military commanders understood that soldier sleep patterns affected not just individual performance, but unit cohesion, morale, and strategic effectiveness. They developed training programs that taught soldiers how to adapt their sleep practices to military requirements, while maintaining the health and spiritual benefits of proper rest. Medieval armies on campaign had elaborate systems for managing group sleep that took into account the natural biphasic sleep pattern, the need for continuous security, and the social and spiritual needs of soldiers who were far from their home communities. These systems often involved rotating groups of soldiers through different phases of the sleep cycle, ensuring that someone was always fully alert, while others were able to rest properly. The logistics of medieval military sleep were substantial. Armies had to transport not just weapons and food, but also the bedding, protective amulets, and other equipment that soldiers needed for proper sleep. Military supply systems included specialists who were responsible for ensuring that soldiers had access to the materials and conditions necessary for maintaining healthy sleep practices, even under campaign conditions. Medieval siege warfare required particularly sophisticated sleep management. Besieging armies might be in position for months, requiring sustainable sleep systems that could maintain effectiveness over extended periods. Besieged defenders had to maintain alertness while under constant threat, requiring sleep practices that could provide rest while maintaining security. Some medieval military tactics specifically targeted enemy sleep patterns. Psychological warfare often involved disrupting enemy sleep through noise, threats, or attacks, timed to interfere with natural rest cycles. Medieval commanders understood that armies with disrupted sleep patterns were more vulnerable to disease, poor decision-making, and reduced fighting effectiveness. Medieval military engineers designed fortifications with sleep security in mind. Castle architecture included specific features for protecting sleeping occupants, secure sleeping chambers, hidden passages for escape during nighttime attacks, and defensive positions that could be manned by guards without disturbing the sleep of off-duty personnel. The training of medieval knights included instruction in sleep practices that would maintain combat effectiveness while providing spiritual protection during the vulnerable sleep period. Knights were taught specific prayers and protective rituals for use during sleep, understanding that their effectiveness in battle depended not just on physical training, but on spiritual health maintained through proper sleep practices. Medieval chivalric codes included explicit expectations about knightly sleep behavior. Knights were expected to maintain dignity and honor even during sleep, to provide protection for others who were sleeping, and to use their sleep time for spiritual development that would enhance their effectiveness as Christian warriors. The economic aspects of medieval military sleep were significant. Professional armies required substantial investments in sleeping equipment, protective gear, and specialized personnel for managing soldier sleep. These costs were considered essential military expenses, reflecting the understanding that proper sleep was crucial for military effectiveness. But the influence of medieval sleep practices on military culture extended beyond immediate tactical considerations. Medieval military traditions, ceremonies, and social structures were all influenced by the understanding of sleep as a vulnerable but spiritually significant time that required community protection and support. Medieval concepts of honor and duty included obligations related to sleep protection. Warriors were expected to provide security for sleeping comrades, to maintain alertness during guard duties, and to demonstrate courage in the face of nighttime dangers that threatened sleeping communities. The relationship between medieval sleep practices and legal systems was complex and far-reaching. Medieval law had to account for the reality that much of life occurred during nighttime hours when people were either asleep or engaged in the social activities of the midnight waking period. This led to sophisticated legal frameworks that distinguished between different types of nighttime activities and their legal implications. Medieval property law included specific provisions for sleep-related issues. Theft or assault that occurred while victims were sleeping was considered more serious than similar crimes committed against awake victims, reflecting the understanding that sleep created a state of particular vulnerability. Conversely, some types of property damage that occurred during legitimate nighttime activities were treated more leniently than daytime offenses. Marriage and family law were significantly affected by medieval sleep practices. Laws governing adultery, domestic violence, and child welfare had to account for the complex sleeping arrangements that were normal in medieval households. Courts had to develop standards for determining when shared sleeping arrangements were appropriate and when they constituted improper behavior. Medieval inheritance law included provisions for sleep-related property, beds, bedding, sleep amulets, and other items that were considered essential for proper sleep. These items were often specifically mentioned in wills and treated as valuable property that required careful distribution among heirs. Commercial law included regulations governing businesses that operated during nighttime hours, inns, night markets, and services that catered to people during their midnight waking periods. These regulations addressed not just business practices, but also the social and spiritual responsibilities of merchants who served customers during the vulnerable nighttime hours. Medieval criminal law distinguished between crimes committed during different parts of the sleep cycle. Offenses that occurred during the midnight waking period were often treated differently from those committed during normal daytime hours or during sleep periods. Courts understood that the quality of consciousness and moral responsibility varied throughout the night. Some medieval legal systems included specific protections for sleeping people and penalties for those who disturbed proper sleep. These laws weren't just about maintaining public order. They were based on the understanding that proper sleep was essential for individual and community health, and that interference with sleep had serious social consequences. Medieval courts sometimes used sleep-related evidence in legal proceedings. Dream testimony was admissible in some circumstances, particularly in cases involving spiritual or supernatural elements. Courts had developed criteria for evaluating the reliability of dream evidence and for distinguishing between ordinary dreams and those that might contain legally relevant information. The training of medieval legal professionals included instruction in sleep-related law and the interpretation of sleep-related evidence. Judges and lawyers were expected to understand the complex relationship between sleep, consciousness, and moral responsibility that was fundamental to medieval legal theory. But perhaps most remarkably, medieval legal systems included provisions for what we might call sleep crimes. offenses that were specifically related to improper sleep practices. These might include failure to provide adequate sleep protection for dependents, engaging in sleep practices that were considered spiritually dangerous to the community, or violating community standards for sleep behavior. Medieval communities often had local regulations governing sleep practices that were enforced through informal social pressure as well as formal legal mechanisms. These community sleep standards reflected shared understanding about what constituted proper sleep behavior and what practices were considered harmful to individual or community welfare. The enforcement of medieval sleep-related laws required specialized knowledge and training. Some medieval communities employed officials whose specific responsibility was to monitor and regulate sleep-related activities. These officials were trained in the complex theories about sleep, dreams, and their social implications that underpinned medieval sleep regulation. Medieval legal remedies for sleep-related problems were sophisticated and varied. Courts could order specific sleep-related penalties or remedies, including requirements for particular sleep practices, prohibitions on certain nighttime activities, or obligations to provide sleep protection for others. The appeal and review processes for medieval sleep-related legal cases often involved consultation with religious authorities, medical experts, and community elders who were considered knowledgeable about proper sleep practices. These consultations reflected the understanding that sleep-related legal issues required expertise that went beyond ordinary legal knowledge. As we near the end of our journey through the weird and wonderful world of medieval sleep, it becomes clear that what we've discovered isn't just a collection of quaint historical curiosities. The medieval approach to sleep represents a fundamentally different way of understanding human rest, consciousness, and the rhythms of daily life, one that might have important lessons for our modern sleep-deprived world. The contrast between medieval and modern sleep practices is stark and revealing. Where medieval people embraced the natural variability of sleep patterns, we've standardized sleep into rigid 8-hour blocks. Where they understood sleep as a social and spiritual activity, we've made it private and secular. Where they worked with their natural circadian rhythms, we've imposed artificial schedules that often fight against our biological nature. Recent scientific research has begun to suggest that some aspects of the medieval approach to sleep might actually be more healthy and natural than our current practices. Studies of people isolated from electric lights and artificial time cues often spontaneously develop sleep patterns remarkably similar to the medieval biphasic system. Sleeping for several hours, waking naturally for a period of quiet activity, then returning to sleep for several more hours. This research suggests that the medieval sleep pattern wasn't just a response to pre-industrial living conditions. It might represent a more natural rhythm of human rest and activity. The consolidation of sleep into a single 8-hour block might be an artificial innovation that, while convenient for industrial scheduling, may not be optimal for human health and well-being. The medieval understanding of the relationship between sleep and creativity also appears to have been surprisingly accurate. Modern neuroscience has confirmed that different types of creative thinking are indeed enhanced during the specific brain states that occur during the early morning hours, exactly the time when medieval people were naturally awake during their midnight waking periods. Many modern artists, writers, and creative professionals have discovered that their most productive and innovative work occurs during the quiet hours of the early morning, often between midnight and 3 a.m. This mirrors the medieval understanding that the midnight waking period was optimal for creative and intellectual work. The medieval recognition of sleep as a vulnerable state requiring community protection also resonates with modern understanding of sleep physiology. We now know that sleep does indeed make people more vulnerable, not to demons, but to medical emergencies, accidents, and other dangers that people might not be able to respond to effectively while unconscious. Modern sleep medicine has begun to recognize the importance of social and environmental factors in sleep quality. Factors that medieval people understood intuitively. The medieval emphasis on sleep environment, bedding quality, and social support for proper sleep anticipated many insights that contemporary sleep research has only recently confirmed. But perhaps most significantly, the medieval understanding of sleep as something more than just physical rest, as a time for creativity, social interaction, spiritual development, and community bonding, offers an alternative to our modern view of sleep as simply a biological necessity that interferes with productivity. The medieval midnight waking period provided time for activities that our modern lifestyle often crowds out: quiet reflection, creative work, intimate conversation, and spiritual contemplation. In our busy, always connected world, we might benefit from rediscovering some version of this built-in time for deeper, more meaningful activities. This doesn't mean we should try to recreate medieval sleep practices exactly. Many aspects of medieval sleep culture were responses to specific historical conditions that no longer exist. Medieval people didn't have electric lights, central heating, modern medical care, or the safety and security systems that we take for granted. Their sleep practices were adaptations to a world that was genuinely more dangerous and unpredictable than ours. But we might consider whether some elements of the medieval approach to sleep could be adapted to modern life. The idea of natural sleep cycles that vary with seasons and individual needs, rather than rigid adherence to standardized schedules. The recognition that sleep can be a time for creativity and social connection, not just unconscious rest. The understanding that sleep environment and preparation rituals matter for sleep quality. Some people have begun experimenting with modified versions of biphasic sleep, allowing themselves to wake naturally during the night and use the wakeful period for quiet activities before returning to sleep. Others have incorporated more ritual and attention into their sleep preparation, understanding that the transition to sleep benefits from the kind of mindful attention that medieval people gave to their bedtime routines. The medieval recognition of individual and seasonal variation in sleep needs also offers an alternative to our one-size-fits-all approach to sleep recommendations. Medieval people understood that different people had different sleep requirements, and that these requirements changed based on age, health, season, and life circumstances. Modern sleep research has confirmed that there is indeed significant individual variation in optimal sleep duration, timing, and patterns. Some people are naturally early risers, others are night owls. Some need more sleep, others need less. Some function well on consistent schedules, others thrive with more variability. The medieval approach of adapting sleep practices to individual needs and circumstances might be more realistic and healthier than trying to force everyone into identical sleep patterns. The medieval understanding of dreams as meaningful experiences, worthy of attention and interpretation, also offers an alternative to our modern tendency to dismiss dreams as meaningless random brain activity. While we don't need to accept medieval theories about demons and divine messages, we might benefit from paying more attention to our dreams as sources of insight, creativity, and self-understanding. Modern neuroscience has revealed that dreams play important roles in memory consolidation, emotional processing, and creative problem-solving. The medieval practice of recording, discussing, and learning from dreams might actually enhance these natural functions of dreaming sleep. But perhaps the most important lesson from medieval sleep practices is the recognition that sleep is not separate from the rest of life. It's integrated into the full spectrum of human experience. Medieval people didn't compartmentalize sleep as something completely different from waking life. They understood sleep, waking, and the transitions between them as parts of a continuous cycle of consciousness and activity. This integrated approach to sleep and waking might help address some of the sleep problems that plague modern society. Instead of treating sleep as something we must do efficiently so we can get back to real life, we might benefit from understanding sleep as an integral part of real life, a time for restoration, creativity, connection, and growth. The medieval approach to sleep also emphasizes the social aspects of rest in ways that might be particularly valuable in our increasingly isolated modern world. Medieval sleep was rarely a solitary activity. It was embedded in family life, community relationships, and social obligations. While we valued privacy and individual space in ways that medieval people didn't, we might also benefit from recognizing that sleep and rest can be social activities that strengthen relationships and community bonds. The medieval understanding of sleep as a time requiring protection and support also suggests that good sleep might require more community investment than we currently provide. Medieval communities took collective responsibility for ensuring that members could sleep safely and well. Modern communities might benefit from similar approaches, whether through better urban planning that reduces sleep-disrupting noise and light workplace policies that support healthy sleep schedules, or social norms that prioritize sleep health over constant availability and productivity. As we conclude this exploration of medieval sleep habits, it's worth reflecting on what we've learned about the relationship between sleep, culture, and human well-being. Medieval people developed their complex sleep practices in response to their particular historical circumstances. But their approach was based on careful observation of human sleep patterns and thoughtful consideration of sleep's role in human life. While we can't and shouldn't try to recreate medieval sleep culture exactly, we might benefit from adopting some of their fundamental insights. That sleep patterns can and should vary based on individual needs and circumstances. That sleep is not just biological rest, but an opportunity for creativity, reflection, and social connection. That good sleep requires attention, preparation, and sometimes community support. And that our relationship with sleep reflects our broader understanding of what it means to live a full and healthy human life. The weird sleep habits of medieval people weren't just historical curiosities, they were sophisticated responses to fundamental human needs that we still share today. By understanding how medieval people approached sleep, we gain insights not just into their world, but into our own relationship with rest, consciousness, and the daily rhythms that shape human existence. In our modern world of artificial lights, standardized schedules, and constant connectivity, we face sleep challenges that medieval people never encountered. But their approach, thoughtful, flexible, integrated, and socially supported, might offer valuable guidance for developing healthier relationships with sleep in our own time. Whether you're watching this documentary during your own midnight waking period, struggling with insomnia in the early morning hours, or simply curious about how differently humans can organize something as basic as sleep, the medieval example reminds us that our current sleep practices are not inevitable or necessarily optimal. They're choices, cultural decisions about how to organize rest and activity that we can examine, question, and potentially modify. The weird sleep habits of medieval people ultimately reveal that sleep is not just a biological function, but a cultural practice, one that reflects our values, our understanding of human nature, and our vision of what constitutes a good life. By exploring how differently people have approached something as fundamental as sleep, we gain perspective on our own choices and perhaps discover new possibilities for rest, creativity, and human flourishing. So the next time you find yourself awake in the quiet hours of the night, remember that you're experiencing something that medieval people would have recognized as completely normal. A natural pause in the sleep cycle that offers opportunities for reflection, creativity, and a different kind of consciousness than what's available during the busy daylight hours. Instead of lying there frustrated about being awake, you might consider what medieval people would have done with this gift of quiet, dark time, and perhaps discover something valuable that our modern rush toward efficient sleep has left behind.